Or how an anonymous boy from rural Austria triggered literally the most devastating conflict in human history. We'll be looking closely at the meticulous mechanics of absolute power, the really dark art of propaganda, and of course the devastating human cost that follows when tyranny goes totally unchecked.
60 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. Over 60 million lives were lost during the Second World War. The face of the world was irreversibly changed, marking generations with profound trauma. You see, this wasn't just your routine clash of nations over borders. It was a 5-year global bloodbath, driven entirely by the fanatical, unyielding will of one single individual, Adolf Hitler. So to really understand how the entire world was plunged into this abyss, we need to trace his trajectory and the highly calculated strategies he used to captivate, coerce, and ultimately ruin a nation.
Let's move to Section 1, An Anonymous Beginning.
Now, you might be wondering, how exactly does someone from complete obscurity become the focal point of absolute terror? Well, it starts in a very unassuming, honestly kind of bleak way. Born in the rural area of Linz, Austria back in April 1889, young Adolf was a lazy but smart student. He really didn't care much for typical academics, but he had this deep, all-consuming passion for drawing. He literally spent hours locked in his room just sketching. But his home life, it was an absolute battleground. He lived in the shadow of a violent, alcoholic father, Alois, who vehemently demanded his son become a civil servant for the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. This led to some incredibly bitter fights. However, when his father died suddenly of a heart attack when Adolf was just 13, it essentially removed the only barrier to his artistic dreams. So by 1907, at the age of 18, he left his provincial life for the capital, Vienna, hoping to make it as an artist. It was an anonymous beginning that gave absolutely zero hint of the devastating events he'd later orchestrate.
Moving on to Section 2, Designing a Dictator.
So, how did a rejected, struggling artist transform into this mesmerizing political figure? Through deliberate design and a highly calculated media strategy. He completely broke from the past. In a time when politicians looked and sounded like dusty relics of the 19th century, he changed up his appearance, cutting his mustache into that modern, recognizable brush shape. But more importantly, he completely revolutionized political speech. Instead of the academic, sort of trembling voices of his contemporaries, he used these short, explosive sentences. He spoke in a rolling, distorted manner that was just completely unheard of in Germany at the time. He understood the media perfectly. He knew he had to create a spark, a massive spectacle, even if it meant violent outbursts, to generate an authentic collective hysteria among the masses.
But here's the thing. He didn't just walk up to a podium and wing it. He obsessively rehearsed his power. In Heinrich Hoffmann's photography studio at 50 Rue Schelling in Munich, Hitler learned to use the camera as a vital communication tool. He'd literally practice his acting in front of mirrors and have Hoffmann photograph him doing it. Then, he'd meticulously study these images to perfect his aggressive hand gestures, clenching his fist to express raw anger, or pointing a vengeful finger to single out a supposed enemy. This explosive visual performance contrasted sharply with the stiff, emotionless politicians of the era, like President Hindenburg, who would just stand there reading speeches while staring down at a piece of paper. Hitler essentially turned his own body into a weapon of persuasion.
Which brings us to Section 3, the propaganda machine.
To truly capture and control the minds of millions, he needed a psychological weapon, and he built exactly that alongside his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. Together, they masterminded this deliberate contradiction in his public image. On one hand, using the plain folks tactic, Hitler was marketed as just an ordinary, simple veteran. He was shown eating small, simple meals, wearing no flashy medals other than the humble Iron Cross, and supposedly living a quiet, secluded life. But simultaneously, they deployed what we call glittering generalities, plastering cities with posters declaring Hitler our last hope, framing him as a compassionate father figure and a savior tied to sacred concepts like loyalty, honor, and order. It was a perfectly calculated paradox. He was one of the crowd, yet elevated high above them. They were constantly manipulating perception to maintain absolute control over the narrative. They used the bandwagon effect, filling the streets with marching brown shirts and cheering crowds to make his movement seem like this unstoppable force of nature. They ruthlessly pinpointed specific enemies, scapegoating Jewish people and communists as the ultimate threats to the pure German nation, and forcefully imposing this toxic worldview on society. And even later on, when the war turned disastrously against them, they used a technique called card stacking. They spread fake news and rumors of miracle weapons produced by German scientists just to keep an exhausted population fighting in a totally lost cause.
Section 4, Expansion and Total War.
Now, the crucial thing to understand is that all this meticulous control of image and message was just a prerequisite for his ultimate goal, aggressive global expansion.
Driven by a fanatical racist ideology, Hitler's ambitions honestly knew no bounds. He sought what he called Lebensraum, or living space, exclusively for his so-called Aryan master race. This quest systematically targeted neighboring populations, expanding forcefully into Austria and Czechoslovakia, and violently coveting Poland. But the ultimate prize, representing both the conquest of vast land and the destruction of communism, was Russia. He plotted an invasion of unprecedented, mind-boggling scale. We're talking about unleashing 4 million soldiers and over 600,000 vehicles in a massive military operation that required immense resources, like oil and rubber, just to sustain it.
And he made absolutely zero secret of the horrors that would accompany this imperial expansion. In a chilling speech to the German parliament, the Reichstag, on January 23, 1939, which was months before the war officially began, he made his intentions crystal clear. He explicitly stated, "The outbreak of war will mean the end of European Jews." He directly tied his impending global military conflict to an unparalleled, systematic genocide. These atrocities weren't just a byproduct of war. They were a central, driving objective of the whole shebang.
Section 5. The ultimate human cost.
To really wrap our heads around the scale of this explainer, we have to tether these massive historical and political mechanics down to the individual human beings who actually suffered under them. Because numbers like 60 million can quickly become abstract, right? So, consider a man named Charles. On a freezing day in October 1943, Charles, a deportee, arrived at Monowitz in the depths of Silesia. Now, this wasn't merely a prison. It was a brutal industrial camp specifically constructed for IG Farben, which was a massive corporation working hand-in-hand with the Nazi war machine. The camp was designed with one horrific purpose: to squeeze slave labor out of prisoners to produce synthetic rubber for the regime's relentless military vehicles. The reality upon arrival was designed to completely erase any sense of human dignity and identity. Stripped of their clothes, their hair shaved from their bodies, and their given names replaced by numbers, Charles and the others faced this cold, mechanical horror. They were gathered for a welcome speech by an SS officer who delivered a clinical, terrifying promise of death. He told them, "You must not leave alive. If you don't obey, it's death. If you don't keep clean, death here. If you steal, death here. Undress." It was literally a perfectly organized apparatus of pure, unadulterated cruelty.
Finally, Section 6. The Fall and Legacy.
This relentless, industrialized machinery of death eventually sparked fierce internal resistance as the world, led by the Allied forces, finally closed in on the collapsing regime. Even figures within the military hierarchy recognized the destructive path they were on. On July 20, 1944, a group of conspirators actually attempted an assassination. They knew the extreme risks. They knew the likelihood of failure. As one conspirator poignantly noted, knowing the world might initially blame them, none of us can bewail his own death. Those who agree to join our circle have put on the robe of Nessus. They accepted certain death, believing that true moral integrity begins when a person is ready to sacrifice their life for their deepest convictions, just to stop the regime.
Ultimately, the regime was crushed. Hitler met his end in a bunker, and his empire of ruin collapsed, leaving behind a divided Germany and a deeply traumatized globe. But the legacy of this dark era is carried by the survivors. Individuals like Charles emerged from the ashes not merely as victims, but as victorious guardians of truth. They are the living memory, leaving us a profound gift, a legacy of vigilance. It's a constant reminder to fight so that such absolute tyrannical power can never ever again rise unchecked to manipulate the masses.
So, we've unpacked the terrifying mechanics of one man's rise to absolute power, the calculated propaganda, the massive battles for living space, and the devastating human toll. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think about this war? What impact did it have on the world? Let's